Thanks very much. First of all, apologies for drowning people in. Oh, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, is everybody okay? Okay. Apologies for if it appears as if I've drowned people in attachments. But the thinking was, it's very difficult for you to get to libraries, and really it's far easier if you've got all the material together rather than having to sort of go and search for it. But it does look as if you had too much material in one go. But what I will do today is just remind you what this course is all about. We've got 3 sessions altogether. The first session, we took a case study to understand community, and out of that we abstracted 3 main ideas. That we look at things in an integrated way, we look at them in an eclectic way, that is in the round, and also we introduce the idea of looking at things dialectically. That is, that we see the tension between things. And for your edification and entertainment, I did send a whole load of dialectical pairings, which I hope you found sort of at least amusing, but also that it is quite indicative. It becomes a way of thinking. You see things in terms, not that something is straightforward, but always things are a matter of debate, a matter of tension between things. Then the second session, which is this morning, looks at the relationship between capital, that is money really, and state, government really, and community. That the tension between those 3. And to do that, I've divided it into 3 parts. Part 2A looks at the story of capitalism, and really we just go a whistle-stop tour from the Industrial Revolution to the present. In 2B, we look at that in terms more of the story of Wales, and particularly the story of Wales in terms of the tension between capital, state, and community, and trying to bring that up to date. And lastly, 2C, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at ideas about the present and the future, about the foundational economy, and introducing the whole idea of community as foundation. And I think that's quite a new sort of idea. Or at least the phrase foundation community is new. In the next session in a week's time, we will develop from that and look at some of the philosophy, some of the politics of community development, and some of the principles of community development as well. So that's where we're going. Then what I'll do now is quickly go through all that material that you had for session 2, just picking out the important stuff. So it'll give you a framework, but you can add meat to those bones in your own time, given that you've got all that material as attachments. To start with then, 2A1, which was the first, or one of the first attachments, 2A1, looks at economics, and it's just worth us saying, sometimes when people think about economics, they tend to think of it as something mathematical, statistical, which it is. It can be about interest rates and employment rates and things in the city and all these sort of things. But basically, economics is more fundamental than that. It's actually about how any society gets the materials, the material goods, the services that it needs. So basically, economics is about 2 things, really. It's about producing things, and given that some people produce things, how do other people get their products? So it's about production and exchange. Somebody producing food, how do other people that don't produce food exchange money to get food? So it's about production and exchange. And the other basic thing about the economy is that it is quite basic to the society, to the community. You know, obviously last week when we were looking at different berries, well, the production of slate, the economy of slate, was basic to the whole society created. Similarly, in the Glow areas, well, the economy of coal was so basic to the South Wales valleys. In Mid Wales, agriculture, woolen textile production, or what have you, have been fundamental, basic. The economy has been basic to the community. So if we make up this whistle-stop tour and started about 1750, and I'm using the Open University material, and I've deliberately used material which is a bit historical itself, because it illustrates how things change throughout our sort of our history, our interpretation of history changes, but also the very story of capitalism changes. One thing about capitalism throughout the period is that it doesn't stay still. It's a dynamic system. It changes the whole time. So if you look at England in 1750, really before the Industrial Revolution takes off, what you have is quite different to most of Europe, is a society with relatively few peasants as such. I mean, compared to France or Russia, France still had maybe a third of the population or even more, 40%, as small farmers, peasants really. But the peasantry had largely disappeared from England by 1750. And what you had was a monetary and market economy. Quite simply, monetary means that most things were bought and sold using money. Okay, there was some sort of barter still going on a local scale, but really throughout the country, money was accepted and used widely. So if you had that, you also had a market. And by market, market means any way in which a produce can be exchanged. In today's world, it could be eBays, it could be Tesco, all those different ways that you have to buy and sell stuff. But widely England, and I say England because Wales and Scotland are a little bit different, but England was ahead of the game in a way in that it had this monetary and market economy. Also, it was ahead of the game in that it had a concentration of population in one place, London. Probably about 15% of the population of England living in London. You can look at that in two different ways. You can look at it as a progressive thing, but you can also look at London, as you could today, as being parasitic in the sense that the people in London couldn't feed themselves, couldn't keep themselves warm. They were dependent on food and fuel, food and fuel and other goods coming from other places. And that's always the story of a metropolis. A metropolis, a centre, is dependent on the periphery for a lot of its basic materials. And we'll come back to that theme later. So for Wales, it meant that a lot of the agriculture in Wales became geared towards producing meat for a market in London, hence the drovers driving cattle mainly from Wales to London to be sold, and these becoming really one of the main sort of agents of change in Wales. In Newcastle upon Tyne, you started to have surface coal being mined and then shipped down the English east coast to London to keep the increasing number of people concentrated in London warm. So, plus what you also had in that England of 1750 was colonies that were producing material which were increasingly being imported into England. So that's the sort of society you had in 1750. By the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution takes off. And I'll quote from some of the material I gave you. It's a quote actually from Adam Smith. That he's describing a factory. And in that factory, one man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 3 distinct operations, so on and so on and so on. And in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some factories are all performed by distinct hands. That is, what the Industrial Revolution creates is factory production. And factory could be buildings like cotton mills and factories producing pins, but also the same sort of system applies in mines and in quarries, that you have a lot of people working together in one place and the work divided, the division of labour into various bits and pieces. So basically the Industrial Revolution, the way I was taught in school was awful. It was just about Turnip Townsend and something spinning Jenny. Well, it was about it was about technological change, but it was a lot more than that. The Industrial Revolution created a new society, industrial capitalism, and a completely different world emerges from that. The main point to remember about the Industrial Revolution is that it brought in a new economic system, industrial capitalism, and what was new about that system was that producing things was now done in order to make a profit. And I'll come to a model of that system in a minute. That making of a profit involved introduction of machinery and a new form of division of labour within the factory. But the factory would be owned by capital. It would be worked by workers. That's some of the basics of that industrial revolution. If we come to attachment 2A2, that sort of summarises really the main points from this section. And this industrial capitalism, what it is about, three main things really. That you have a capitalist class who buy the means of production, and they buy workers' labour, and they organise the production, and they make the profits and keep the profits. On the other hand, we have another class, a working class, who don't own any of the means of production, but they sell their labour for a wage in order to live. So that's the first point. The second point, the pursuit of profit coupled with technological change really drives this whole system, and it becomes a dynamic system of change. And the third point is, once this system was established, and particularly that early period between say 1770 and 1850, it's a very unstable period. Workers are in rebellion a lot of the time because they haven't enough money to feed their families. There's a whole sort of change within the ruling class, really, between landowners and the new capitalist class. And then there's a huge demand for the vote for all men initially in that early period. So huge struggles around that. We'll come to that when we see take the example of the story of Wales, where it's very clearly illustrated. But that first period is quite unstable. I want to move on to table or number 2A3, and I don't know if you got access to that. It'd be quite handy to have a look at it. It's a rather an odd sort of diagrammatic representation of capitalism. It's an odd one with chairs and sort of unisex men with circular saws above their heads and stuff. If you've got access to that, it'd be quite handy, because although it's an odd sort of model, and remember, a model in the social sciences, it's not like a model train or a model aeroplane where you're trying to replicate on a small scale as precisely as you can what you're trying to model. But oh, that's it, brilliant. Okay, if you can focus on that top part, the sort of circular part, this model is very much an abstraction of the thing that you're trying to model. But if we start at the more or less that inner circle, top inner circle, and there's a wad of money there. Yeah, just go up a little bit. Yeah, can you see? Okay, and it says money, and there's a wad of money. Right. It's the capitalist that has the money. Somebody was an entrepreneur, somebody has the money, and that person organizes production and buys means of production. And in this case, in the inner circle, it's in the model just two circular saws. But also employs, and in this case, for unisex sort of characters or uniform characters anyway, and significantly a clock above their heads, which indicates really this is not slavery. The capitalist doesn't own these workers. Rather, he buys their time and they sell their time and labor. Then production is organized, and the organization, the management of the work is done either directly by the capitalist or by a manager appointed by the capitalist. So the workers are set to work and they produce in this model 6 chairs. Well, simple question is, who owns the chairs? Well, it's actually the person that owns the capital. It's not the person or the workers that produce the chairs as such. The chairs are then sold, exchanged, and the whole idea of the process is that you get more money at the end of the process than at the beginning. That is, that you accumulate profit. The capitalist accumulating profit, well, I suppose today they could go off to enjoy themselves in the Bahamas, but they're more likely to think, well, this is rather good, we can make some more money. So the firm grows, and you increase the means of production. So yeah, you have 3 circular saws. Now you have an extra 2 workers. You manage those workers, and you produce now 9 chairs, and you make more money, and so on and so forth. Okay, that seems rather a silly portrayal, but in fact, if you understand that, it really gives you a basic understanding of the whole nature of the system. Because, okay, instead of chairs, last week we were talking about slate, but you could put wagons of coal, wagons of uranium in Namibia, wagons of copper in Chile, you could put television sets, aeroplane wings, whatever. Or you could put the whole lot together. If you think of the whole system and everything that's produced, it follows that sort of model. And whether you're pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist, both sets of people would agree that that is the basic nature of the system. The debate comes about whether that's the best system or not. Yeah? Then if you move down on that same piece of paper, if you can move down to the chart, and very briefly, you can use, I think, 3 characteristics to define this capitalism. And these are characteristics that are true for capitalism from the beginning to the present. The process of production, that is what we've just described really, that circuit of production, in order to make a profit, well, firms buy means of production, employ workers, organise the production, and sell the product. And that's as true today as it was in the pin factory of 1776. But it changes as well. The scale, the products, and methods of production change throughout the whole period. So we're massively producing a lot more than we ever produced, and so on and so forth. And there are things produced now which were unimaginable, like computers and what have you, even for my grandfather's generation, things like television sets, which have been unimaginable. But other things have gone out of production, like most sort of candles, except sort of craft candles. The second feature, class structure, well, that remains the same in that capital owns the firms and gets the profits. Now, the working class, they don't own their means of production, they have to sell their labour to capital, work and labour wages. But that working class has changed the whole time, new divisions the whole time. Firms tend to become larger, they become globalised, and the ownership of capital has changed. You don't really have a Lord Penrhyn or a David Davis Lambin in the same way as you did in the 19th and 20th centuries. Capitalism has become more a system of multinationals. And we'll come to that again. And the third feature that stays the same within capitalism is that division of labour. There's a division of labour between firms, different firms do different things, and then things are exchanged between companies, between firms. They're exchanged between firms and households. As households, we buy things from companies. Then there's a division of labour within the factory or within the quarry or within whatever the production system is, where managers organise the division of labour. And then, importantly, there's also a division of labour within households. And traditionally, that division has been very much along gender lines. And it's really important. In our last session, we'll touch on some sort of feminist economics. But it's really important to think of why typically a man going out to bake bread in a factory would be considered as part of the economy. But if a woman baked a loaf at home, that would be regarded as consumption. Okay, that idea between consumption and production and the gender relationship is really important in understanding a lot of the characteristics of our society. So that is sort of just that sort of model of capitalism, the basic things. If we then move on to A4, and this is from Open University material in the 1970s, beginning of the 1970s, and I deliberately used stuff like this because it also illustrates how things have changed since the 1970s. But the division of labour, the class structure, and the process of production, those are described there, and I think we've touched on most of the things. Obviously, there have been changes within them, but the conclusion they come to is that basically the division of labour, the class structure, and the process of production, they do stay the same, but also change within capitalism. The important one to, I think, look at is the one at the bottom where you have that funny little graph. And the graph illustrates the way in which state expenditure has grown. The role of the state has grown enormously. In about 1831, it was about 10%. That is that graph at the bottom there. It then remains more or less at that level throughout the 19th century. It grows a bit during the various wars, but really in the 20th century, and particularly the second half of the 20th century, post the Second World War, you have a huge growth of the state. And some people would argue, well, no longer is that capitalism. People at the time would sort of say, well, this is a mixed economy, this is social democracy, this is not really the old capitalism at all. It's been so modified that the role of the state is so much greater that you could no longer call it capitalism as such. That was a huge debate at the time. We'll come back to that debate because really, again, capitalism doesn't stay still. And after the 1970s, particularly after about 77, 78, capitalism changes quite fundamentally. We'll come to that. And we'll touch on that. 2A5 is, again, Open University material, but that is material I think you can read yourselves. I will have really explained the essence of it already. And if we move to 2A6, this is material a little bit later now in 1984, and the world looks a bit different in 1984 to what it looked like even in 1977. And the part I want you to get out of that is the conclusion to a long article, but what the article is really saying, this is 2A6, I'll find it. What it's saying is really the world is becoming globalized more and more and more. All right, you did have an international economy before that. And in fact, Wales has been more of an international economy than virtually any other country in the world. Our slate, our coal, our iron, our steel, they were always huge exports. And there was so much backwards and forwards of people as well between Wales and, say, the United States, all sorts of the whole parts of the world. What I wanted to get out of this particular piece of literature from the conclusions is that these people looking at the economy are saying in 1984 that we have now an increasingly globalized world. And what's happening is that the links between huge multinational corporations, your ICI, your Shell, your huge pharmacy companies, also your media companies, they're becoming bigger and bigger the whole time. But there are links between the multinational corporations that are producing things, the banks which are financing things, and the states, the countries in which all this is operating. And basically what they're saying is, because of the huge growth in multinational corporations, something, I don't know what the figures are by now, but something like 80% of the world's trade goes through about 200 multinational corporations by now. Shell has a bigger budget than the whole of Nigeria. That is, we tend to think of countries, I think the world in terms of economic units in countries, but almost we need to think of the world as in terms of economic units, more in terms of multinational corporations. That's the increasing reality of the world. So this is pointing out the way in which the links between multinationals, banks, and states change. And what it means is that national sovereignty becomes a lot weaker. That is, governments become a lot weaker because you're confronted with banks and multinational corporations which exist outside your control because they exist across countries, they're transnational. So you don't have a way of really controlling them unless you do it in some sort of multinational way. But that isn't happening. And so what happens during this period is that the banks and the multinational corporations and the huge media companies, they come to dominate countries. And also states become more and more the handmaidens of these multinational corporations. And that's at the expense of community. And that's why it's so important for us to understand this relationship between capital, state, and community. It's a triangle. And that triangle, you can imagine it as the state being at one corner, multinationals or capital at the others, at one of the other corners of the triangle, and community at the other. And you can imagine how that triangle, the powers within that triangle have changed. And there have been significant changes from the period 1977 to the present. One of the things that the banks were able to do, because they were multinational, if you think of HSBC, it is the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. When I was a student, I joined the Midland Bank. When my grandfather banked, not very a lot to bank, he banked with the North Wales Bank. The North Wales Bank was amalgamated for a time with the South Wales Bank and the other Wales Bank. That was swollen, that was taken up, swollen up by the Midland Bank, and later the Midland Bank was swollen up by the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. But that is the nature of banking. It is now transnational, multinational. It meant that they could actually get governments to deregulate. That is, they allowed the banks to really avoid a lot of control about their prudence. And this was happening gradually over 30 years from the end of the 70s. They were also financing different political parties, and political parties repaid them by deregulation. And this was happening across the capitalist world, across the Western world. This really leads us on to 2008, when all this deregulation, all this sort of freedom the banks had to do as they wished, meant that they avoided prudence, and it led to this financial crash in 2008. The irony is that it's really states and communities that had to pay to bail out the banks that had been given all this freedom to do as they wished. Now then, what all that means, if you look at 2A7, and what we have in 2A7, if I can find it, is some odd diagrams, and rather paradoxically, there's a champagne glass, or something the shape of the champagne glass, and it illustrates the disparity of income across the world. If you look at that champagne glass, the top 20% of the world in terms of income, that's how much the richest get. And at the bottom, the 20% of the people on this planet at the bottom have to manage on less than 1.5% of world income. That is by 1991. Okay, and that was getting so much worse between the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 90s. And really, that champagne glass hasn't changed its shape very much subsequently. If anything, it's got worse. If you move to the bottom of that page, there's a block diagram, and this is for the United States, but it tells you very clearly the story of this period. If you look at between 1950 and 1978, which is the top part, and the poorest 20% in the States, and remember there is an immense poverty in the United States, the richest country in the world in many respects, but it's also a country with such a high percentage of people who are really poor. But at least in that 1950, 1978 period, the poorest people at the end of the period in 78 were 140% on average better off than they were in 1950. And more or less all 20% sections doubled their income between 1950 and 78. You've got to get that into proportion. These are stats, these are percentages. You know, if you're on $1 a day in 1950 and you end up on $2.40 in 78, you're better off but it doesn't compare to the richest 20%, who have been on $1,000 a day in 1950 and will be on $2,000 a day in 1978. Okay, beware of percentages and stats. Look at what happens between 78 and 93. The poorest 20% in the States are worse off by 90% in 93 than they were in 78. The same is true for the next 20% and the next 20%. The only people that are really gaining in that period are the richest. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Literally, that's what the figures show. If we then move on to 2A8, I've just included that in your pack. It's a very interesting account. It's in a book that was a bestseller in Germany, translated to many languages. Didn't really take off in the UK, but was really important in France and in Italy. And it was written by two journalists, German journalists, who were able to obtain information surreptitiously about a conference that was held in secret in San Francisco. And this, I included about 3 or 4 pages out of the book. And basically, it's hard to believe that these people were meeting Bush, Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, and all the heads of the multinational corporations. And they were looking at how they saw the future of the world. And these were the people that they thought themselves in charge of the world. And their vision for the future could be summed up in 2 words that they were using, or 2 expressions. One was 2080. That is, what they foresaw was that really about 20% of the world's population were really needed to produce things. The other 80% would be largely redundant. And then the question arose, well, what do we do with this 80%? And they came up with a horrible expression, which I won't even use. But it was basically about a sort of banal entertainment. That is, you would keep these people happy with flooding them with digital electronic entertainment the whole time. And this was talked about in these cold sort of ways. There's an account by the head of this Sun Corporation, and he's asked, well, how many people do you employ? And he says, well, there are 6 people I employ full time on a regular contract, but I also employ 30,000 people across the world, but they're all employed by computer, they work on computers, and they're fired on computers. That is, they are casual labour. That is the perspective of these people coldly meeting at this time, at the end of the 20th century. I'll leave that for you to read if you wish. And then we come to 2008 and something out of the Irish Times in 2008 by Noam Chomsky. And basically Chomsky is saying this is what deregulation, this is what freedom for multinationals and multinational banks has meant. That now we have the virtual collapse of the financial system, but being bailed out, ironically, by states, but at the expense of communities. There's one quote I'll just read from the last page of that article. He quotes John Dewey. This is on 2A14. Politics is the shadow cast on society by big business, says John Dewey, who was really the 20th century social philosopher leading in the States. And politics is the shadow cast on society by big business, and will remain so as long as power resides in business for private profit, for private control of banking, land, industry, reinforced by command of the press, less agents, and other means of publicity and propaganda. That is, he's seen the way that the states has changed throughout the 20th century and how big business becomes to dominate politics, to dominate life, to dominate culture. If we now move to the second part of this today, I'm aware time is taking me a bit more time than I thought. Are you all right for a bit of time again? Very quickly, I'll go through 2B, which is the changing relationship between capital, state and community in Wales. And I've written something which summarises the whole thing. But basically, if we make a whistle-stop tour of the whole capitalist period in Wales, I think there's 6 periods: 1770, 1850, very unstable, struggle between capitalists and landowners for control of Parliament in London. Then there are huge working class struggles as that early capitalism creates so much instability. Think of things like the Merthyr Rising in 1831, Scotch cattle, before that a little bit the Rebecca riots, all the Chartist movement. Also the growth of religion, or non-conformist religion in Wales. Also things like the circulating schools. And importantly for Wales, different to the other Celtic countries, Welsh becomes the language of a modern working class, different to what happened in Scotland or Ireland or in Britain. The language is transferred from a rural background to an industrial background. 1850 to 1914, this capitalism starts to settle down. Things get better, and living conditions improve. Life expectancy doubles in this period. The capitalist class, they begin to take more control of Parliament, and by doing that, they introduce banking laws and company laws, which makes capitalism more efficient. But also some acts improve the conditions of the working class as well: Factory Acts, Mine Acts, and so on. And then these new industrial communities, they increasingly develop themselves. You have huge activities: co-ops, chapels, institutes, the miners' institutes, the workers' institutes generally, building societies, etc. By the end of this period, the period leading up to the First World War, this working class has become really organised. It's become confident. Socialist ideas are taking grip. Trade unions are really effective. I was looking at the history of the trade union movement in Caernarfon, for example. Even the farm workers, half the farm workers of Anglesey were in a trade union by 1910. So huge power. Now, Marxists would argue, well, what this led to was that this struggle between profit and wages was going more and more in the direction of wages as the working class became more organised and more powerful. And it depends how you analyse the First World War, but one way of looking at the First World War is to say, well, this is happening in Wales, in Britain. The working class is becoming more organised, eating into the profits of capitalists. Exactly the same thing is happening in Germany. But what really restores the level of profitability is this First World War. I know there are other complex matters associated with that First World War, but that is certainly one factor. That's one factor that certainly Marxist analysis points to. Tragically, that First World War destroys a lot of the basic ideas of that early working class movement. It somehow or other tarnishes those early ideas. If you look at a really significant document for the South Wales coalfield, the Miners' Next Step, 1912, and in that, it's produced by coal miners, and it's a manifesto of what they want to happen to the coal industry. And basically what they wanted was, in the Miners' Next Step, was for the miners to own the pits and to run them democratically themselves. For the state to be involved in distribution of coal, but not for the state to be involved in the production of coal. What we did get after the Second World War was the nationalisation of the coal industry. But that nationalisation was very bureaucratic and it was very centralised and very different to what that early socialist movement wanted. That is, the early socialist movement had a far greater community perspective than the later socialism, which tended to have a more state perspective. And I think that's important in thinking about politics and philosophy today. But more of that next week. The post-war period, First World War, a boom for a few years. 1921, coal production in Wales was at its highest in coal exports. But the whole thing crashes in 1929 with the Wall Street crash. Again, the banks still had their freedom. What it leads to is a huge worldwide economic depression. The response of governments, particularly in Britain, protectionism, avoid imports from other countries, but everybody does the same. And also, the government in Britain prioritises the value of the pound. The gold standard is more important than the price of coal. Because they protect the price of the pound, it means the coal exports are too expensive, and that intensifies the depression in the South Wales country and in other parts as well. Okay, that is, these are political decisions. There's no getting away. There's no getting away from politics, right? You can be whatever your politics are, but the whole world is political. There's no escaping that. That period, it led to little government intervention, depression. Women suffered particularly in that period. 500,000 people left Wales in the 1920s and 1930s. It immense harm to the Welsh language, because what was the point of the Welsh language if the whole point of education was to educate your kids to get out of Wales? 1945, after the Second World War, again, the Second World War restores full employment, restores profitability. The profit on capital is restored. But something quite remarkable happens in 1944. There is, before the end of the war, an agreement held at Bretton Woods in the United States, an agreement that the world has to be different after the Second World War. We can't go back to what we had after the First World War. And remarkably, that was led by an economist, John Maynard Keynes, who really chaired that meeting and had his own way to set up a world economy after 1945. And that is the golden period of capitalism, where really you had the promotion of international trade. What was set up was the IMF and the World Trade Organization. You had government intervention at home, the growth of the economy, full employment. That became the responsibility of government. There was control of capital moving out of Britain or out of different countries. You also had regional policies, that is, a recognition that some parts of the UK, some regions were more affluent than others. You had to do something to shift wealth from one region to another. And this really is a period of immense change, right? Things like the NHS setup, welfare systems, local government, all these things. I was born in 1945, not very much choice about it, but really I had that golden period. I didn't worry about employment. I had a full grant to go to college. Nobody ever talked about charging me for fees. And I could come out of college and more or less choose how I wanted, where I wanted to work, and if I didn't like it, I could go somewhere else. And a society where we were confident about the future. This comes tumbling down gradually, 1977, 78, 79, and the period 77 to 2008 sees neoliberal globalisation. That is, the world becomes now the world of the multinationals. They have their own way now, and the power of transnational capital grows, and individual governments become weaker. And those governments now have, it depends how you analyse things, but you could look at the period 45 to 77, a period of growth, and during that growth, profits grew and wages grew. But by the end of the period, you could argue that the working class was again so well organised across Europe, across a lot of the capitalist world, they were eating into the profits again. And really what happens is, to restore profit, you have these huge changes towards neoliberal globalisation. In Britain, you see the priority of breaking the strength of the trade union movement. You have a miners' strike in 1984, 85, and the breaking of that union really meant the breaking of the power of the working class as it was then. Since then, trade union membership was more than half, and the strength of the trade unions has been considerably curtailed. And this period now, 1977 to 2008, it leads to casualisation of labour, it leads to increasingly greater and greater inequality of wealth, the growth of poverty. You see, particularly in Wales, Wales was fairly well off in that golden period of 45 to 77 in terms of income and wages, but really with the decline of regional policy, the decline of the basic industries, the deindustrialisation of manufacturing, because that's what the multinationals needed, then all this changes. Wales becomes a relatively poor region. And in that as well, part of the neoliberal globalisation is the privatisation of things. Anything that makes money, privatise it. If it doesn't make money, socialise it. But even the things which are social, like education, the health service, the ideas of the market come into it. But within the health service, you create markets. Within education, you create markets. And also a whole culture which moves away from community towards the emphasis on the individual. Yeah? And you see it in all sorts of language. But you don't talk about employment, you talk about employability. If you're unemployed, it's not because that structurally there is unemployment in the economy. You're unemployed because you're not employable. Yeah? It's your employability. That is, the move is away from community towards the individual. 2008 to 2020, we see the collapse of the banks, the increasing austerity to pay for the money borrowed to bail out the banks. And we're, I think, quite familiar with that period. But increasing globalization, increasing privatization, increasing income inequality, and increasing poverty, child poverty, and an increasing alienation amongst people. So the concluding lesson from this whistle-stop tour of the relationship between state, capital and community in Wales is that communities in Wales over this period from the 1770s have been subject to change. And really, to interpret any one period, we need to know the relationship between capital, state and community. What is absolutely vital, in the middle of the period that we're in now, we must plan for the future. We must have, otherwise I fear what's going to happen whenever this virus period, if and when it's over. Who's going to pay for the economic downturn that's resulted from this? Is it yet again going to be the poorest people who will have to pay? Unless we organise ourselves, and it's vital that we organise ourselves as communities, we must do what we can to prevent that. And that moves me to the last part, which is 2C. 2C1, you can read that yourselves if you will. It's just a description of the ideas of the foundational economy. 2C2, that stuff I've written myself to sum up this session. But basically, at the moment, and I'll concentrate on Wales, government economic policy in Wales is still about, I don't know what the figures are now, but the last time I looked, 80% of economic development money from Welsh government went to multinationals. That is, the hope was and is to attract multinationals here, and they will sort out the jobs in time. If you look at the ideas of the foundational economy, you'll find 40% of jobs in Wales are in the foundational economy. If we started to support those properly, then that could be quite different. And if you put together ideas of supporting the foundation economy, plus the ideas of community development, then you would have a very powerful alternative in Wales, which would be not about maximising profit, which would not be about lowest possible costs of production, but would be about maximising the welfare and the well-being of our people. And that is all possible. There are elements within the Welsh Government that are moving in that direction. Only slowly. There are struggles within Welsh Government about economic policy, but it's vital that we create some sort of movement in Wales that actually pushes the agenda and pushes government in Wales, because basically we do have a left government in Wales. We are still a left country. We are still a country with radical ideas. And government in Wales, if there was power to push them, instead of being lobbied the whole time by multinationals, by Hitachi and by Shell and all the large companies, if there was a lobby of community, a powerful lobby of community, as there is in Sweden, because communities have organised themselves as a community movement in Sweden, have a huge influence on the state. But within this triangle I was describing of state, community, and capital, at the moment, capital has the dominant influence of the state. But that could change, and we could change that, but that is up to us. First of all, we have to understand the system, and secondly, we have to organise. And it would be possible to organise a community development movement in Wales that could powerfully shift a Wales which is governed by people, and we know these people, whose hearts are really with the people, not with capital. So that's the end of that sermon. Thanks very much for listening. I hope I haven't drowned you with too much material. It's odd in a way. My whole life I believed in an education which is about the shape of the forest, not an education which hides the forest behind the trees. But sometimes talking about the whole lot, the whole period of capitalism in one go is a bit absurd. But you've got the material there, and if you've got the interest, and if your hearts are in changing things, then this is what you can do. Does that make some sort of sense to everybody? Okay, thanks very much.
It does.
Thank you very much. Yes. So I know we've gone on a bit longer than we thought, but has anyone got any questions?
I would like a seminar after that.
Yeah, I would love a seminar as well, but face to face. Yeah,
I have hundreds of questions.
Yeah.
My historical knowledge, though, why is it that peasants were much more prevalent in France, for instance, than in the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Russia oedd yn Russia was serfdom, wasn't it?
Yes. In a way, you did have the English Revolution of 1668, where you did remove really the main powers of the monarchy, whereas in France you had this ruling class which was dominated by an emperor. The main interests were land and colonies, really. Whereas this new class hid behind constitutional monarchy after the removal of Charles I. These were people that were more interested in money and markets. And I mean, that gave them leeway to plus, I mean, if you look at the land mass of France is quite different, isn't it? I think it's twice the land mass of Britain, and it's far better land and it's a better climate. Yeah, but it doesn't. Answers to these questions, there are many dimensions to them, aren't there?
Yeah.
No, I would love a seminar, because a lot of this material, okay, you can give lectures like this, but the real value is actually people to have a chance to cogitate a bit about it and then discuss it. Because I tend to have, because we're doing these things in a sort of broad brush, the statements tend to be a bit sweeping and they're oversimplifications. But otherwise, we would get bogged down in endless sort of justification of every statement that one makes.
I was quite surprised that that capitalism still kept on, or the profit kept on reaching with productivity during the wars, but I suppose that was because of arms products.
Oh,
Yeah?
absolutely, yeah. And you've got a working class that accepts working conditions that they would never accept otherwise. You drag women into the workforce in the First World War and in the Second World War, and you pay them peanuts, really.
Yeah.
And also, for capitalism, one of the problems is overproduction. That is, you produce so many cars, but the world can only buy so many cars. So the car companies can't keep on producing cars. But if you got half your working class in uniform, using up all the material that the other half is producing, the tanks and the guns and what have you, then in a way, production. I mean, the United States in between 1941 and 1947, 41 and 45, in the United States, the GNP of the country doubled. That is, it was producing twice as much once it entered into the war, and profits quadrupled. That is, the rate of profitability quadrupled. Yeah, I mean, that I'm oversimplifying the Second World War. The Second World War was also about fascism and questions as well.
Yeah.
So, if there are no other questions, we need we'll say goodbye till this time next week. But one of the things we are looking at is the extent to which we can actually pull this material together to be something that is available online for people, and has that broad discussion. I agree. We really do need a seminar where we can actually sit down and really explore these issues, and hopefully, who knows, if there ever comes a point where we can socially distance in one place, then maybe we can aim to still achieve that at some point. But
there's hope in the fact that coming out of the Second World War, that they went, yes, we need change. That's the feeling that we're at now. It's the, yes, we need change. We need to get wheels in motion now. So I found hope in that statement at that point of time there.
Yeah, I agree. Right, well, Selwyn, can we just thank you again very much for all the work you put into this and for your contribution. And I'm sure I, like lots of others, are really looking forward to the session next week. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Yeah,